Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another episode of Fixing the Forgotten, where we discuss underpowered or underperforming lords, units, heroes, regiments of renown, and the like for a faction, and what could be done to improve them or make them more appealing and more competitive in Total War Warhammer 2. And this time around, we are going to be discussing the Force of the Vampire Counts, a faction that until rather recently was probably one of the top 3 in the game, and widely considered kind of overpowered, but lately with the nerfs to summoning, with the nerfs to Invocation of the Heck, they've kind of been brought down to earth, and it's made them a much more reasonable faction. I think the only really crazy matchup they still have is against Beastmen, but that's more of a Beastmen problem than anything else. And I think the nerfs to Vampire Counts have now brought it to the spot where it's really important to discuss how they can be buffed and what can be done to improve the units that have kind of fallen behind, because the Vampire Counts have always had quite a few units, lords, and the like that are just not popular, not appealing, and kind of forgotten. And so I wanted to discuss them here, and there's a lot to discuss here. Now, there aren't any regiments of renown. I actually thought that, in general, the Vampire Count regiments of renown are very well balanced at the moment. The only possible exception, the Tithe, but even them I think is in a good spot. The only reason I think that they're maybe in a bad spot is because they're a little pricey, but I didn't think they were really worth including. So we're going to hop right in, and starting off with the Lords. And there's actually quite a lot of Lord stuff to talk about here. I'm actually going to start the battle here because there are some comparisons I want to run. And first and foremost is Helmengorst. Helmengorst, whatever you want to call him, he's well known for being, well, a joke. You did see him in one of my recent videos where we were messing around some absolutely ridiculous cows versus Vampire Count armies. But by and large, Helmengorst is kind of a disaster. Now, really, the fact that he's bad boils down to one thing, and that's just how immobile and inflexible and weak to sniping he is. Now, obviously, he's got 5,000 HP, which is cool. Based on that, you'd think that he's, kind of like a Slann Mage Beast. Slann Mage Beasts are not terrible, to be honest. They don't have the best combat stats. They don't have particularly great resistances in many ways, but they are able to function. You can use them as a great caster and a support tool. And Helmengorst fails, so why? Well, first of all, I would say his speed. His speed is terrible, and it's not even just bad to the point that it's like 20, like in the high 20s or low 30s, like most other undead units. Unfortunately, I don't have Graveguard or anything here, but Graveguard, I think it's at a comfy 27. He's at 23. He's zombie speed. This is really crippling. This hurts him a huge amount, makes him very difficult to maneuver into position, makes him incredibly vulnerable. Now, personally, I think that this needs to be buffed. I think this is something that right off the bat needs to be looked at with Gorst, because Gorst's traits, if you look at Gorst's lineup of traits, especially when he's on a card, it's actually not terrible. He's got the Unholy Lodestone, which is an AoE heal. He does have Vigor Mortis, buffs your troops nearby. Reliquary of Corruption causes damage to nearby enemies. It's the Mortis engine effect. And you can get it on your Lord, which means you don't have to bring a Mortis engine, which technically isn't bad. That's not terrible at all. He's got his full lineup of undead Vampire Count spells. And finally, he's got the Liber Noctis, which does grant extra winds of magic and power recharge rate. The problem is that he's just so slow. So I think the first buff that he could and should receive, in my opinion, is an extra 4 or 5 speed. Nothing crazy, nothing to put him into even the 30s, but something that would make it so that he can at least keep up with a general Vampire Count battle line. So he's like Graveguard tier instead of being zombie tier, because that really slows down your line. Second of all, another recommendation I would have is giving him improved missile resistance. This is one thing that made Slann viable, is the fact that Slann got boosted. I think when the game dropped, they only had like 25% missile resistance, I want to say, maybe it was like 20 or 30%, something around there, but they had lower missile resistance than they have now. And it got buffed to 40%, I think, after the first or second patch going into Warhammer 2, and it made Slann a viable choice. They still weren't popular, mostly because at the time Krokkar especially was just ridiculous, but they were still a very potent choice, and in my opinion remain competitive to date. And I think that could be huge for Gorst. If his missile resistance was buffed to say 25 or 30%, that would make him a much more reliable and survivable character. Would make him much more respectable, in my opinion. So those are two survivability boosts I think he needs, and would make him much more reasonable, because he's fairly cheap, which is a nice little perk. You can bring him stripped down for like 1,500 or so gold. You get a Mortis engine effect in that, all the corpse card effects, which is great. And if he had a little more mobility, he'd suddenly become, in my opinion, a decent, if not amazing, choice. other possibilities I think could use some work. One, Awaken from the Grave right now is, in my opinion, very weak. The problem is that summons obviously got a nerf in the last patch. They're now they now just disintegrate. Or after a set period of time, there's no keeping them alive. You can't just keep refreshing their life by hitting them with Invocation of an Echo or anything. Now this is a problem for Gorst because his summon is expensive. He doesn't get a standard zombie summon. He gets Awaken from the Grave, which summons Graveguards. Now this isn't bad. The problem is that Graveguards really need to just stay in the fight and keep fighting. They're kind of a stand and hold unit. The Overcast version summons a White King. The problem is that because neither version stays around long enough, you really don't get your money's worth, and it kind of kills the viability and usefulness of this summon. In my opinion, either he should lose Awaken from the Grave and it should simply be moved in as an ability, maybe with just one cast or one charge that lets you summon a unit of Graveguard or White King. Otherwise, I think, and you get your normal zombies in tow. Otherwise, I think the duration needs to be greatly increased on the Graveguards because right now it just feels very, very short. Another thing I would mention is that his fire, another possibility, removing his fire weakness, because Gorst, unless I'm mistaken, I don't. He does get regen, so I guess perhaps removing regen and taking away the fire weakness might be better, just to make him a little more survivable, especially against Dragon Breaths. Though I suppose if he did get missile resist, that wouldn't be a problem. And those would really be my suggestions, just to make Gorst a little more viable. Right now he's become a smidgen better, but he's still just not good. And I think just giving him more mobility and missile resist would be the key here. Now next up, and there's quite a few lords that I feel deserve to be touched upon. Next up, we do have the Vampire Lord, generic one. Now Vampire Lord, the biggest problem is that the Vampire Lord is just very vanilla and brings basically nothing to the field. He's got no utility. He comes in with generic lore vampires, which is not bad. It's not a bad lore, but he costs almost the same as Manfred. He only costs 50 gold less than Manfred, for example. He gives you some extra combat and survivability items. He gives you Charmed Shield and Sword of Anti-Heroes potentially, but he doesn't get crazy winds of magic regeneration. And if you're going to bring a combat lord, you're going to go with something like Red Duke, or the Blood Dragon Lord, or honestly even the Strigoi Ghoul King. You're gonna bring one of those. You're not going to bring a. You're not going to, or in fact, not the Strigoi Ghoul King, the Strigoi Vampire Lord, in fact. But you're not gonna bother with a normal Vampire Count Lord. So my recommendation, in fact, would be to give him Arcane Conduit. I think that would be an easiest fix because honestly, stat-wise, he's not bad for his price. He's actually pretty perfectly statted. He costs the same as a Karstein Lord, despite being having the same stats. He actually, he costs 50 less than a Karstein Lord, despite having the same stats. So I don't think he's necessarily bad stat-wise. He just brings no utility, and his offensive combat stats are not really worth it because you've got better options for that. I think giving him an Arcane Conduit would make him a very vanilla lord. It would keep him very vanilla, but it would mean that he's a nice middle ground. He's standing somewhere between being tanky, because he's got the Charmed Shield, aggressive, because he does have the Sword of Anti-Heroes. Arcane Conduit means he has slightly better casting potential, and he's got a tiny bit of utility with Undeath Resurgence. So you've got this, it would make him a super well-rounded lord. That's not necessarily great in any way, but he works. And I think that would make him a little more appealing, just because he, instead of being just bad in a few categories that you can get better lords in, it would at least make him decent in more things. Next up, Isabella von Karstein. I think this is not a surprise. I think everybody here probably expected her to make the list. Her biggest problem, in my opinion, is the fact that, well, to put it kindly, her perks suck. She's basically a hero or a lord who's oriented at buffing heroes or herself, the lord in that case, through the Blood Chalice of Bathory. Which grants a huge boost to healing. It grants more vigor. It technically should be a big buff. Besides that, she does have the Red Fury, which is a nice targeted buff to vigor and AP damage, once again aimed at an ally or herself, and this is actually targetable at anything, not even heroes. But besides that, she's got generic lore vampires, Master Beguilement, which is a nice little utility spell, also available on Vlad. But the thing is, first of all, Vampire Count Goon Squads are not that popular nowadays. Vampire Heroes are very expensive, and they're actually another one I'm going to touch on in a little bit, because I think they need a buff as well. And honestly, most of your Vampire Count heroes are going to get healed or to their max over the course of a game, either through their own self-healing, their own self-regen, or they're going to be healed to that point through Invocation of the Heck hitting them, because they're going to be your prized units. The problem is that Blood Chalice of Bathory, besides that, besides healing, just grants vigor, and vigor is quite frankly just not that important. It's not a bad thing. It's not terrible, but it just doesn't cut the mustard. And besides that, yeah, okay, you've got Master Bagama. That's nice, but that's not a huge selling point. The other thing is that Isabelle's kind of got this weird thing where she's got 65 melee defense, which is really high, but then her HP is really low. Sort of like, not low, I guess, but it's a tiny bit better than the Vampire Count Lord, in fact. But compared to Vlad, who's got over 4,000 HP and multiple survivability items, she's not particularly survivable in comparison to that, despite her high melee defense. So the low HP just cuts into that. I think boosting her HP by about 500 would be a good move, just to make Blood Chalice of Bathory have a little more room to work. And second of all, I think Blood Chalice of Bathory should be given another effect. Perhaps most likely only lasting for the duration, but perhaps say plus either add Frenzy to a unit or grant greater melee attack and weapon strength for duration, as they're sort of invigorated by chugging the blood of some poor small folk. But something that would make it useful past the point of simply healing your heroes, because you're going to almost always heal cap your heroes in a game as vampire counts, unless you really screwed up, in which case Blood Chalice isn't going to save you anyway. So being able to get more utility out of it would just make it a far better item, in my opinion. And the last but not least lord I didn't want to cover is the Strigoi Ghoul King. This guy simply falls off because he's just not as good as the Strigoi Vampire Lord. And so the base cost difference between the two is about 150, and the two are basically literally direct upgrades of one another. The Strigoi Ghoul King is just a downgraded Vampire Lord, but the problem is there's just a monstrous gap in their performance. 21 less melee attack, 10 less melee defense, less HP, 300 less HP, and then his items. Now, granted, with all his items, he's even more cheaper. I think he's like 300 or 400 gold cheaper than the Strigoi Vampire Lord. But his items are just not that good. You don't get this amazing single self heal with Ghoul King of Usharan. You don't get Claws of Morcane, and now you do get some other items. You get Potion of Strength, for example, and you do get Bloodlust, which you can apply to yourself for an ally. But the simple fact is that, yeah, a Ghoul King is basically just a crappy version of a Vampire Lord. But the price difference isn't big enough to warrant that, to make him appealing. Now, in my opinion, the simplest fix here is just to cut his price. There's less of a gap in performance between the versions mounted on Terrorgeist. So I think the Strigoi Ghoul King's Terrorgeist cost should be increased, and his base cost should be decreased. I think she should lose about 100 gold worth of base cost, because that, I think, would make him a little more appealing as your budget combat choice. Otherwise, I think they could at least even out his HP pool with the Strigoi Vampire Lord to make them a little more on even footing if they wanted to not go with the cheaper route. But I definitely do think that the Ghoul King simply doesn't perform in comparison to the Vampire Lord. And now, on a slight side note, but something that could buff both the Vampire Lord as well as the Ghoul King would once again be to buff Command of the Unliving, much as in Gore's case, buffing Ray the Graveguard, and making it so it now, besides summoning Crypt-Ghouls, those Crypt-Ghouls will last a little longer, improve the duration on that unit. And with that out of the way, we are on to Heroes, which is a category that I only have one comment here. Now, the Banshee is there, but that is for because I think Ethereals in general should be touched. I had an idea for improving the Ethereals in general, and I figured the Banshee should be included in that. So, touching on the Vampire of Shadows here, or Vampire Heroes in general. In my opinion, the White King has a bit of a place. The Banshee has a place. The Necromancer all have a place. The problem with the Vampire of Shadows and the Vampire of Death, both of the Vampire Heroes, is that they're an interesting hybrid of caster and combat hero. The problem is that they're just too expensive to bring to get an extra lore. Before, it was already bad enough for the Lore of Death Vampire because Manfred came with Lore of Death. So, if you wanted Lore of Death spells, you just bring Manfred and get your Lore of Vampires, and Lore of Death all in one without having to cough up extra cash for a Vampire of Death. Now it's even worse because the Lamian Vampire Lord, the Lamian Vampiress, she comes in with most of your important spells from Lore of Shadows. She gets Penumbral Pendulum, she gets Enfeebling Foe, I do believe she gets Pit of Shades, I want to say. Or perhaps Occam's Mind Razor. I don't really use that third spell. I know she doesn't get Melkoth's Miasma, though, which is a little unfortunate. Besides that, she gets most of your important shadow spells. So there's very little appeal to bring a Vampire of Shadows, unless you're, or a Vampire of Death, unless you're looking to do a combat-oriented Goon Squad. The problem is that, for that, they are incredibly squishy. Now, they've got this cool heal, Immortal Will, heals themselves. The problem is that with such low HP, once again, with the Hunger, with the Dark Benediction, keeping them from breaking, Vampires of Shadows and Death basically hit their heal cap every time, and the fact that they can burst heal is literally useless. And the other thing is that 2700 HP is very, very low. Now, obviously, their combat stats can help keep them alive, but do keep in mind these combat stats here are actually being inflated by being in proximity, of course. So this is actually 60 and 35. Melee defense is very low at 35. Armor of 90 is okay, but only 2700 HP is definitely a huge weakness. Compare that to Osiris Scarvet. And I understand that Osiris Scarvet is pure combat here, but you're paying for a hybrid in the case of the Vampire kind of hero. And you only get like 200 more HP than a Skink Priest on foot. You get 400 less HP than Osiris Scarvet. You get less HP than a High Elf Noble, I do believe. Which, in my opinion, is an issue. It makes this unit just not appealing as a combat hero. Because it's just so squishy. And in a roster where you've got better Agoonings tools like Terrorgeist, or honestly, White King is decent. In a sense. Not great, passable. Or Vargulfs, especially. I think that's just a weakness. And I think that giving her another 200 or 300 HP a pop for the Vampire Count heroes, for the Vampire heroes, would be a good way of improving them. Otherwise, plus 5 melee defense. Now, this could come at a slight increase in their cost, making them slightly more expensive, but I think that, in general, right now, the simple fact is their lore is not worth it, in general, because you can get other heroes, or your lords with said lores, and so you need to be bringing them for combat, and for combat, right now, they don't have the HP pool, or the survivability, or the melee defense to really sustain there. So, in my opinion, bumping that melee defense up to 40 baseline rather than 35 base, and bumping that HP pull up to like 2800 or 2900 would be a little better. Now with that out of the way, on to the, well, I guess I should touch on the Banshee, but onto the units. So first and foremost, I do want to touch on the Ethereals, because that's a trifecta, and this would extend to other factions with Ethereal units. So for example, the Grey Knight, or the Green Knight, the Green Knight, the Damned Paladin, the Dwarf Ancestors. But I do believe, and this is something I've been considering for a while, is that one of the big problems for Wraith units right now is the fact that they just aren't able to do their damage consistently. They don't do much damage. And ultimately they get ground down. This is especially true for Cairn Wraiths, but even to an extent true for Hex Wraiths and Banshees. They just get ground down by non-AP. They don't have the survivability that you would expect, despite having 75% damage mitigation with physical resist. They have very low melee defense. And this is especially problematic for Cairn Wraiths. So I thought Perfect Vigor could be good. It would make it so that the unit, while not amazing in the initial stages of an engagement, would scale well. As you progress to the mid and later stages, as your opponent's Vigor tires out, you could then start hitting more consistently, start dishing out a lot more hurt, and it will reward you for doing more damage, for keeping your ethereal units alive and intact. You would also put a little more pressure on your opponent to nuke them down faster. But the main thing, of course, is that that Perfect Vigor would just help make them a little more successful in the long run. It would make them a long-haul unit. Now, on the topic of the Banshee, I don't actually think she needs additional buffs besides that. Or not. It's not even that she needs that buff. This buff is more oriented at the units like Cairn Wraiths, Syreens, and Hex Wraiths. But she would, in my opinion, should get that buff if it goes to other ethereal units for the sake of consistency. Cairn Wraiths are a unit that's just generally troubled. Now, personally, I think that this buff to give them a Perfect Vigor would be the right way to go, without any cost increases or anything of that sort. That said, if another option I could see being applied to them would be removing their splash. This is not known by everybody, but the Cairn Wraiths do actually have splash attacks. But removing their splash attacks and giving them 60 models instead of 45. This would then boost their HP up to 4920, I believe, if my head math is correct, which would make them a lot less vulnerable to just getting sniped super fast by a someone dropping a Flaming Sword of Ruin on a unit, or Fist of Orc or something. And I think that could be very helpful. Otherwise, definitely I think Immunity to Vigor would be huge for these guys and a big buff. If they did shift to a 60 model unit, I think they might need a price increase for like 50 or 100. Obviously, there would be that loss of splash, though, so do keep that in mind. Some of their effective damage would be removed. Finally, Hex Wraiths. This, once again, not a unit that I think needs a buff, but if it would get this Immunity to Vigor, I think they would need to go up in cost by about 50, just to make them balanced. Now, next up, we do have Crypt Ghouls, and this is a unit that I'm sure many people here are not surprised to see. In my opinion, kind of a crap unit. So, very squishy, no non-existent armor, only 10 armor. HP, that's pretty low. 5670 is actually on par with High Elf Spearmen and Dark Elf Bleak Swords and Spears. That's really bad. That's very squishy, especially given they have 10 armor, no shields, no stock, no Vanguard, nothing to close the gap faster besides slightly above average speed of 38. They have very bad stats of only 27 and 25. 27 melee attack, 25 melee defense. It's once again being boosted by Gorst, so a bit of a mistake here in the way I set things up, but it does make them seem better than they actually are. They're actually pretty potato tier. So their stats, as you can see, are pretty terrible. The only thing they've got going for them is weapon strength, but even then, it's only 4 AP damage, so they're very bad at doing damage. And they cost 500 gold. They're not cheap. Keep in mind that with these stats that are basically comparable to Empire Swordsmen, or worse, honestly, because they've got less armor, less melee stats. They've only got poison and weapon strength. With those stats, the unit is... yeah, it costs 500 gold. So I think there's a few ways to approach buffing these guys. One would be simply reducing their cost to 450, because I think that's honestly a more accurate price point for them. They don't get Murderous Prowess. They don't get any shields, which Swordsmen and Dark Elf Bleak Swords, for example, do. So making them cheaper would actually make them, in my opinion, more efficient at just dishing out hurt to a squishier unit without paying for shield. But the accepted, of course, trade would be that you don't have shields. Otherwise, I could see giving them Frenzy being a viable option. It's been given to it's obviously on some it's obviously on Savage Orcs, but obviously they had it on tabletop, which I don't believe Crypt Ghouls did. But yeah, that is, I think, could be a buff for these guys, is giving them Frenzy, but, because they are supposed to be like insane cannibal type people, and that could be sort of fitting. And plus, it would work pretty well in my opinion. Their leadership is low, and obviously they don't suffer penalties for fear, terror, that sort of thing. But I think stripping them of Frenzy would not be the most difficult for a lot of factions. I think it would be definitely doable. Next up, I'm going to touch on Crypt Horrors. Similar case, honestly, to Crypt Ghouls, where their stats are just terrible baseline. Once again, they do have poison. In this case, they have AP, but very low armor. Basically non-existent at only 15. 6,700 HP is not bad, but when they do have regen. But the simple fact is these guys cost the same as Trolls. And while obviously they don't break like Trolls, their stats are god-awful. Their damage output is pitiful, and poison does not compensate. So I think in these guys' case, once again, Frenzy could be a fix, because it would make their melee attack a little more competitive. Otherwise, buffing their armor back up to 25 or like 30 would be nice. Or, barring all those things, I do think weapon strength could be boosted. I think there's just a lot of generic and easy buffs that could be applied here. Even a cost reduction to like 750 or 700 could work. But otherwise, boosting their weapon strength by, say, 5 normal and 10 AP would be good. It would still leave them on the low end of Monsters Infantry, but at least it would make them a little better. Next up, Black Knights. Once again, a unit that I think is only slightly undertuned. All in all, they're not bad for their cost, but they do sit in an uncomfortable spot between Blood Knights and vanilla Black Knights, where they're good generic cavalry. They can definitely be used. The Regiment of Renown is very popular, actually, in my experience, or maybe not very popular, but reasonably popular because they've got regen. So the baseline unit is not terrible, but it's very unforgiving in my opinion. The terrible melee defense, especially of 22, means that this unit is the most cycle chargey of all cycle charge cap in the entire game. More so than even Knights of the Blazing Sun, in my opinion, who have pretty low melee defense, I think of 24. But you think I know that off the top of my head because I play so much Empire. But in my opinion, these guys are just very flimsy and can't do anything in sustained combat because their melee attack is so very low. It's their melee attack's only 24. So unlike Knights of the Blazing Sun, who said 40 melee attack, these guys only have 24. And their melee defense is only 22. So if you accidentally leave them in sustained combat for any period of time, you're screwed. And these guys are going to die. Now, obviously, they're cheap-ish by the standards of other 1,000 to 1,200 gold cav. But I think a slight upward tweak to their melee attack and defense of like +2 on each would be a decent improvement. Something that would make them a little more appealing and make it so they're not as unforgiving for a player who's either not as good on micro or hell, even someone who just slips up for a second. These guys can just burn down very, very quickly. They don't have the best leadership either, which doesn't help there. They will start rumbling, and I think that's just a weakness that could be resolved there. Next up, Vargheist, a unit that, once again, I think might not be too surprising here. These bad boys don't look terrible on paper. They actually trade really effectively into the Ripperdactyls, who I brought here as a comparison. But the Simple Vanquishes are very flimsy. They do hit hard, but they don't have much in the way of AP. If we look at their stats, and obviously these are Frenzy-roided stats, but they've only got 38 AP damage, which, you know, it's high percentage. It's like 40% of their base damage, I think. I'm probably around. It's probably a little lower than that, but about 40% of their base damage is AP. But still, that's not the greatest amount ever. Their armor is very bad. Their speed is not that amazing. Their HP is very low. They don't have any sort of self-sustain in prolonged combat. They're like an incredibly glass cannon unit that just doesn't quite. Ripperdactyls, because they have got AP, they can just annihilate units very, very quickly. Whereas Vargheist, because they don't have AP, they often just fail. They kind of get shut down hard. And these guys, I think, are in a little bit of a tough spot. Personally, I think they'll just straight boost to HP. Give them like 100, give them like 240 or so HP. Just about that would be 12, not 12. That would be 20 HP per model. I think would be a decent improvement. Just make them a little tankier, make them a little more forgiving, and I think that would be a good approach if there's not going to be a total revamp, like making them a pure AP, like a very AP oriented. Because apparently they were AP, I think, at tabletop, so that could be a cool way to do it as well. Swap out their low AP for high, or low non-AP for high AP, perhaps with a cost increase to like 1,100, something along those lines. But just something to make them a little more competitive, in my opinion, because they are almost a functional unit. I don't think, and I actually think this is true for many of these units. They're right on the edge of being good, but not quite there. And I think just boosting their either survivability a tiny bit or boosting their offensive stats against more targets would be the way to go for guys. Finally, a unit that unfortunately makes the cut here is the Corpse Guard with Balefire. The only Corpse Guard that makes the cut, because the normal Corpse Guard is so cheap that getting Vigor Mortis for like 250 is not bad at all if you have a big front line, especially if you've got like Graveguard heavy. It's great. Lodestone, getting heals for 500, great. The problem is that the Balefire Corpse Guard, you're paying extra for an ability that's incredibly situational, incredibly lock dependent essentially. And while it's very potent, it's just very difficult to get into position. Now, first and foremost, I think a decent buff would be just giving it 15 more range on the effect, just so you can just snare more units, and I think that would be pretty useful. And besides that, obviously cost decrease, though at this point this unit is very cheap and bordering right on normal Corpse Guard territory, and the ability, because it can be so potent, you don't want it to be too cheap. So really, I think a buff needs to be made to that Balefire effect. Otherwise, making it some sort of active ability where you can target an enemy hero or lord or unit, and it denies your opponent wins a magic recharge, which would make it more consistent, make it more reliable. Now, this might have to come with a either charge limitation or a cost increase, but I think that would make it much more acceptable and a much more viable unit. Now, that is my list of vampire count units that, in my opinion, need improvement. I do admit this was a very long one, and there's a lot of, especially heroes and lords, that I think need touching on. In the case of the vampire counts, I simply think there's a lot of them that are weak or just not in a great spot within their own roster, especially. As far as units, I do think most of them are decent, but there's definitely a few that could use a little bit of love here and there. Hopefully, you guys have your own input and your own comments, critiques, and questions you could share down below. I'll be sure to respond as soon as I can. Always looking, this is more like, this is just a brainstorming thing. It's looking at what can be done to improve units. Perhaps you guys think there are other units that are underperforming, or other units that are, or maybe some of these units are not underperforming in your opinion. Maybe you found great niches for them. And honestly, if you've had those experiences, I'd love to hear them, because quite frankly, everyone has their way of playing. Everyone has their way of doing things. Sometimes you see or find some stuff is viable that other people just don't think of or don't use. So I think the discussion and the brainstorming is always fun. So with that out of the way, I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you found it interesting and perhaps thought-provoking. As I mentioned, leave your thoughts, comments, all that down below. And I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.